History remembers Ivan VI as a ghost, crowned emperor of Russia at just 2 months old, deposed before he could speak, imprisoned before he could walk, and murdered before he could rule. But to understand how close he came to surviving, we need to go back, not to the prison cell, but to the court that created him, when Empress Anna took the Russian throne in 1730. She did not come alone. She brought the Portland with her. Suspicious of the old Russian families, the Durgus, the Goitlids, Anna instead turned to Baltic German officials, men who owed her power entirely to her, men who would not challenge her authority. At this new court stood three figures: Ernst von Baron, the so-called Great Emperor. Officially, he held little power for most of Anna's reign. In reality, he influenced everything: patronage, appointments, exile lists. Nothing moved without Baron's shadow passing over it. And a Osterman, the architect of Russian foreign policy, calculating, influent European diplomacy, and deeply pragmatic. He reshaped the civil service and tied Russia more closely to the balance of power politics of Central Europe. Berkeland Christoph von Munich, a military reformer and engineer, he organized the Russian military army more modern and increasingly more Prussian. Lines, discipline, tightened, drills, intensified, engineering products expanded, fortifications and canals across the empire. To their supporters, these men were efficient modernizers. To their enemies, there were foreign occupiers wearing Russian uniforms. This period became known as the period of the German period. That's what I'll just call it, simplify it. Anyways, a word that still carries immense controversy in Russian history. It was defined by three forces: political repression, the secret translator. Russia's political office operated aggressively. Thousands were investigated, exiled to Siberia, or executed for insulting the majesty. The line between dissent and treason was often thin and arbitrary. Taxes rose sharply to fund court extravagance and the War of Polish Succession. Election was rigorous. The burden fell, as always, on the peasantry. German became the language of the influence at court. Military reforms emphasized Prussian-style discipline. Many Russian nobles felt sidelined in their own empire. And then there was the Ice Palace. In one of the most infamous spectacles of Anna's reign, a disgraced prince was forced to marry a maid and spend their wedding in a palace constructed entirely of ice. It was meant to be court entertainment, but it became a symbol. To critics, it represented everything wrong with the era: cruelty, foreign excesses, and a regime detached from Russian tradition. When Anna died in 1740, she left not an adult heir, but to an infant, Ivan VI, 2 months old. The empire would be ruled in his name by Baron, as well as regent, and after Baron's switch overthrow, Ivan's mother, Anna, young, inexperienced, and politically hesitant, Anna inherited an empire that already divided between Russian traditionalists and a German-influenced administrative elite. In the shadows, and waiting in the shadows was a rival with a powerful name: Elizabeth Petrino. Daughter of Peter the Great. The coup of December 6, 1741 is often remembered as inevitable, but it was not. It was a desperate gamble that nearly failed before it began. Elizabeth was not a master conspirator. Her connections to the French ambassador were widely known. Her ties to the elite Republicans, ski guards, were barely concealed. St. Petersburg was alive with rumor. Foreign diplomats warned the region repeatedly. Elizabeth is plotting. Her advisors urged action. Arrest her now. At first, Anna hesitated. That hesitation most likely saved Aunt Elizabeth's life. But then she finally acted. She summoned Elizabeth to the Winter Palace. Imagine the scene. A tense chamber. Advisor's presence. Many guards nearby. And in Anna's hand, a letter, the evidence. The correspondence between Elizabeth and French conspirators outlining plans to seize the throne. This was treason. Clear. Dangerous. Clear. Documented. Dangerous. Anna confronted her cousin directly, and Elizabeth did something unexpected. She cried. She swore loyalty. She claimed innocence. She blamed enemies on spreading malicious lies. And Anna, the gentle, cautious, infamously indecisive, faltered. Instead of ordering an immediate arrest, she apologized. Let Elizabeth walk out of the palace. That single decision changed Russian history. Because Elizabeth returned home shaken. She was deeply religious. She knew the stakes. Failure meant execution, or worse, forced plunger in a convent. Her head shaved, her name erased. She hesitated. For hours she reportedly prayed before an icon. Her physician and co-conspirator, John, understood the danger of delay. According to legend, he presented her with two cards. On one, Elizabeth crowned empress. On the other, Elizabeth as a nun, shunned and disgraced. He told her she had until morning to choose. Meanwhile, time was running out. The higher-ranking officers of the Probansky Guards were not committed revolutionaries. Many were loyal to the existing regime. Some were German-born. If the alarm were raised, they would side with the regent. Elizabeth's plan depended on speed and emotion. Around 2 a.m., she made her move. Wrapped in a white cloak, she went directly to the barracks. No official decree, no military escort, just claim. She stood proudly before 300 guardsmen and asked a simple question. Do you know whose daughter I am? They did. She was Peter the Great's child. That mattered. Before senior officers could intervene, before orders could be given, the enlisted men rallied to her. Momentum became legitimacy. By dawn, the regent was arrested and Ivan VI was deposed. Elizabeth was proclaimed empress. Ivan would spend the next 24 years in solitary confinement, and then people tried to free him. After his failed escape attempt, he was murdered, most likely under the orders of now Empress Elizabeth, to ensure she had no competition for the throne in the future. It looked swift, bloodless, but almost tested, but it wasn't. If Anna had acted decisively in that palace chamber, if Elizabeth had been detained instead of dismissed, if the officers had alerted even 30 minutes earlier, the barracks doors would have closed and Ivan VI would not be remembered as a ghost. Now with the history out of the way, let's explore where our timeline diverges from our own. Let's rewind back to at the Summer Palace. Anna holds the letter in her hand. The evidence is undeniable. Her advisors are watching. The room is tense. Elizabeth cries. She swears loyalty, blames the rumors. But this time, the regent does not hesitate. She remembers the warnings from foreign diplomats. She remembers the whispers in the guards. She remembers that her son's throne depends on firmness, not forgiveness. Instead of apologizing, she signals the guards. Elizabeth, daughter of Ivan the Great, is arrested on charges of high treason. The palace doors close, and just like that, the coup dies before it is born. The arrest sends shockwaves through St. Petersburg. The French ambassador scrambles to destroy correspondence. Members of the Perovsky regiment suddenly find themselves under quiet investigation. The secret chancellery begins working day and night. This is no longer Buren's Russia, but the machinery still exists. Interrogations follow. Stroke is detained. Letters are seized. Names are extracted. The trial is swift. Unlike in our timeline, there is no mercy, no convict, no quiet exile. Elizabeth is formally condemned for conspiracy against the regent and the person of the emperor. Within days, she's executed. Publicly? Perhaps not, but definitely. The message is clear. The line of Peter the Great is not untouchable. And for the first time since 1725, the palace coups stop, because no one dares. Anna has learned her lesson. Gentleness has nearly cost her son his crown. From this point forward, her regency hardens. The secret chancellorly expands its authority. The guard regiments are reorganized. Officers with questionable loyalties are reassigned or retired. Foreign influence shifts sharply. France loses its leverage at court overnight. Instead of the Orstman faction gains strength. With Russian foreign policy becomes colder, more calculated, more aligned with Central European interests rather than French intrigue. More importantly, the German administrative elite survives. In our timeline, Elizabeth purged many of them and restored Russian dominance at court, but in this one, they entrench themselves. Baltic German nobles secure key positions in finance, the army, and provincial administration. Germany becomes even more dominant in elite circles. Promotions increasingly depend on education and bureaucratic loyalty, not noble lineage. To some historians, this alternate timeline would be period we called the second Batarian discipline, an empire not defined by charisma but by procedure. And at the center of it all is a boy. Ivan VI did not grow up in isolation, he grows up in power. Raised within a court dominated by Osterman's pragmatism and Munich's military philosophy, his education reflects their worldview. He learns German as his first language of his tutors, Russian as his second, the language of his subjects, French as his third, the language of diplomacy. Unlike Peter III in our timeline, Ivan is not an outsider, suddenly dropped onto the throne. He is shaped from infancy to rule. He's taught that Russia depends on military discipline, financial official stability, bureaucratic efficiency, suppression of factionalism. He studies Frederick William I of Prussia, the Soldier King. He studies Peter the Great, but focused more on reform than spectacle. By the time he turns 18 and is formally crowned emperor, he's not flamboyant, he's methodical, reserved, and intensely serious. Now we reach the critical test, 1756. The 7 Years' War begins. In our timeline, Elizabeth's Russia joins Austria, and against Frederick the Great. Russian armies push deep into Prussia. Berlin is occupied. Frederick is on the brink of collapse. Then Elizabeth dies. Peter III withdraws Russia from the war. The so-called miracle of House of Brandenburg. But in this timeline, there is no Elizabeth, no sudden reversal, and more importantly, no automatic hostility towards Prussia. Ivan VI, shaped by German advisors and administrating Prussian efficiency, is far less inclined to crush Frederick. Russia may remain neutral at first, or more radically align with Prussia from the beginning. If Russia sides with Prussia, Austria faces Frederick alone. The balance of power shifts dramatically. Prussia emerges not as a battered survivor, but as a dominant Central European power, earlier and stronger. This changes everything. A stronger Prussia in the 1760s means earlier consolidation of the German states, a weaker Austria, a different trajectory for Polish partitions, and a radically altered path forward 19th century European nationalism. Russia, meanwhile, gained something else, strategic partnership. Instead of exhausting itself in East Prussia, it focuses southward toward the Ottoman Empire and the Black Sea. Expansion becomes colder, more deliberate, less theatrical than under Catherine. It's just as ambitious. But stability comes at a price. This Russia is efficient, disciplined, centralized, and increasingly alien to its own elite and peasantry. The court speaks German. The bureaucracy prizes order over charisma. The secret chancellery monitors dissent relentlessly. Without Elizabeth's cultural Russification, without Catherine's flirtation with Enlightenment ideals, the empire becomes a machine. It functions, but it does not inspire. The gap between the German-speaking administrative elite and the Russian-speaking masses widens into something dangerous. Resentment simmers not just among the peasants, but along the sideline Russian nobles who feel disciplined in their own state. In our excuse me. In our timeline, Catherine balanced autocracy with image, art, and intellectual engagement. Ivan does not. He governs like a commander, expecting regiments, and pressure builds quietly beneath the surface. By the 1760s, Ivan is no longer the child emperor. He is a fully formed autocrat, disciplined, cautious, and obsessed with stability. Russia is no longer volatile, it is predictable, and predictability changes Europe. In our timeline, Catherine the Great played a central role in the partition to Poland. She manipulated politics, installed a former lover as king, and slowly dismantled the Commonwealth. But in this timeline, there's no Catherine, there is no personal intrigue, diverging policy. Instead, Poland becomes a strategic calculation. A Prussian-aligned Russia does not fear Frederick the Great, it coordinates with him. That means earlier diplomatic planning, clearer territorial divisions, and less chaotic war over influence. Poland may still be partitioned, its internal weakness makes that likely, but it happens in a colder, more bureaucratic manner. And here's the key difference. A strong Prussian-Russian understanding creates a powerful Eastern Bloc decades earlier. Austria becomes the odd one out. The Habsburgs, already strained by Prussia's rise, now face a coordinated pressure from the east. Central Europe shifts from a triangular rivalry to a dual system. Berlin and St. Petersburg, Vienna reacting. Free from the catastrophic involvement in the 7 Years' War, Russia turned south earlier and more consistently. Access to warm water ports remains a strategic obsession, but Ivan approaches the Ottoman Empire differently than Catherine did. No flamboyant Greek project, no dramatic claims of restoring Byzantium. Instead, it's incremental pressure, strengthening influence in the Black Sea, fortifying southern borders, undermining the Ottoman authority through proxy conflicts. This makes Russian expansion slower but harder to reverse. By the 19th century, Russia in this timeline, Russia has already consolidated its dominance over the northern Black Sea without dramatic wars that defined Catherine's reign. It became a fortress empire, expanding quietly. But here is where the ripple becomes a wave. If Russia supports Prussia during the 7 Years' War, or at minimum refuses to destroy it, then Frederick emerges stronger and earlier. A confident Prussia in the 1760s and 1770s accelerates German consolidation, not necessarily full unification, but deeper military and economic integration of northern German states. And crucially, Prussia and Russia are not rivals, they are partners. This shifts the entire 19th century balance of power. In our timeline, German unification under Bismarck was built partly on careful diplomacy with Russia. And in this timeline, the alignment is foundational. Decades earlier, France becomes more isolated, Austria becomes more fragile, and the map of Europe hardens around a Berlin, St. Petersburg axis. No Catherine the Great. We also lose something else. Catherine was more than conqueror. She corresponded with Voltaire. She partisaned the arts. She embraced the Enlightenment language, even if selectively. Without her, Russia does not experience that cultural movement. No hemorrhagic expansion as a symbol of Enlightenment absolutism. No flirtation with constitutional language. No cultivated Western image. Ivan VI's Russia does not charm Europe, it intimidates it. It becomes known not for brilliance, but for efficiency, and internally that matters. A hyper-disciplined state that can suppress dissent, it cannot erase identity. By the early 1800s in this timeline, several tensions are sharper than in our own. Russian nobles resent the German dominance at court. Serfdom persists under a ruler who values order over reform. The bureaucracy expands, but representation does not. National identity becomes more self-conscious in reaction to elite Germanization. Instead of a Russia that experiments cautiously with reforms in the 19th century, we get a Russia that doubles down on control and changes the nature of eventual revolution. In our timeline, the 19th century saw waves of reform attempts, from Alexander II's emancipation of the serfs to limited modernization, but in this timeline, may come later, and when reform comes late, it comes violently. The resentment is not just social, it is cultural. Perception that the empire is ruled by, has been ruled for generations by an elite that does not fully reflect nor understand its people. That kind of divide does not produce gradualism. It produces a rupture. By the time we reach the era of the Napoleonic War in this timeline, Europe may look dramatically different. A stronger Prussia, a more rigid Russia, a weakened Austria, a France facing a hardened Eastern coalition. But by the early 19th century, Ivan VI is long dead, but the system he built remains. An empire of regulation, an army drilled to mechanical precision, a bureaucracy that values loyalty over Russia is powerful, but it is brittle. In our timeline, the Russian nobles retain a sense of cultural ownership over their empire, even when they disagreed with the Tsar. In this timeline, that bond is weaker. For decades, the advancement required in fluency in German, administrative culture, politic elites dominated the high office. Merit mattered, but access to that metrodonic ladder was uneven. The old Russian aristocracy never forgot being sidelined. Over generations, a quiet nationalism forms, not liberal at first, but aristocratic. Russia for Russians. Not against the Tsar, at least initially, but against the system surrounding them. That kind of sentiment is dangerous, because once identity becomes political, it spreads. Ivan VI valued order above all else. Serfdom, however unjust, was orderly. It ensured agricultural output. It preserved hierarchy. It prevented rapid social upheaval. So the reform is postponed again. By the time the Industrial Revolution begins creeping into Europe, Russia in this timeline is even further behind socially than our own. Factories rise, cities swell, peasants immigrate. They immigrate into a state that has perfected surveillance. Urban workers are monitored. Print culture is restricted. Political socials are infiltrated early. For a while, repression works. But repression has a paradox. It prevents small reforms, which means pressure builds for massive ones. Meanwhile, the Berlin-Petersburg relationship deepens. By the mid-century, Prussia leads a more cohesive German sphere. When a full unification eventually comes, whether earlier or more smoothly than in 1871, it does so with Russia not as a wary observer, but as a strategic guarantor. This creates a continental superbloc. France fears it. Britain watches it carefully. Austria adapts or fades. Europe becomes less balanced. And when Europe becomes less balanced, crises become larger. In our timeline, Russia's great explosion came in 1917, born of war, industrial strain, and political paralysis. But in this timeline, the explosion might come differently. Not entirely socialist, not entirely liberal, but nationalist and anti-elite. The rhetoric is sharper, not just down with aristocracy, but down with foreign dominion. Generations of German-speaking court culture became a symbol of alienation. Even if rulers were born in Russia, perception matters more than generosity. Instead of a revolution driven primarily by class ideology, this Russia may face a revolution driven by identity and cultural and political. And identified-based revolutions are often more violent because compromise feels like a betrayal. The system to prevent palace coups, to prevent instability, to prevent chaos, may create a far more explosive collapse, not a slow erosion of authority, but a reckoning. Because the longer a society is kept rigid, the more catastrophic its breaking point. A baby crown, a child in prison, a name erased from coins and portraits, but ghosts are harmless. An emperor who rules Russia is not. If Anna had ordered an arrest instead of offering one apology. If Elizabeth had hesitated just a little longer, if the guards had received their orders 30 minutes earlier, Russia may not have produced Catherine the Great. It may not have dazzled Europe with a monument correspondence and an imperial theater. Instead, it might have been built something colder, a Russia allied with Prussia, early Prussia, a Europe divided more sharply, a state more efficient than its and distant from its people. Ivan the Sixth surviving does not create a weaker Russia. It may create a stronger one, stronger armies, stronger alliances, stronger bureaucracy. But with strong comes without flexibility is dangerous, because empires do not fall from only fall from weakness. Sometimes they fall from rigidity. And in this alternate world, the child emperor history forgot becomes the architect of a system that reshapes Europe and possibly makes its eventual upheaval even more dramatic. History gave us a ghost, but almost gave us something far consequential, an emperor who lived. So what do you think? Would a Persian-aligned Russia stabilize Europe, or destabilize it even sooner? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, this is the Rhodes Lesser Taken, signing off.